Welcome back to a brand new video and legal breaking reporting. Today's reporting is on the results from the Supreme Court historic hearing on arguments challenging Trump's birthright citizenship order and whether judges can issue nationwide injunctions. Let's get into the reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, the Supreme Court heard arguments today on whether federal district courts can issue nationwide injunctions blocking Trump's policies. The justices also discussed the potential implications of allowing the Trump administration to deny citizenship documents to some people born in the United States. The courts decided in Trump v. Casa. Their decision is expected to have significant implications for the power of lower courts to issue nationwide injunctions. Additionally, the courts issued a decision in Barnes v. Felix. Ladies and gentlemen, nationwide injunctions. The Supreme Court grappled with the question of whether a single federal judge can block a Trump administration policy across the entire country. Several conservative justices expressed concerns about the power of lower courts to issue injunctions. Ladies and gentlemen, birthright citizenship. The justices considered practical implications of allowing the administration to deny citizenship documents to some people who are born in the United States, potentially overturning centuries of understanding about American citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, Trump v. Casa. The case specifically involved orders blocking President Trump's effort to end birthright citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, Barnes v. Trump. Barnes v. Felix. The court also issued a decision in this case, which involved a police shooting and the Fifth Court's moment of threat to rule for evaluating such incidents. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the live reporting from CNN regarding the issue. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the Supreme Court is hearing historic arguments today on birthright citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, here's what you need to know. High stakes hearing. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments today in a case about the enforcement of President Donald Trump's birthright citizenship order. The main question for the justices is whether lower courts overstepped their authority by blocking that January 20 order on a nationwide basis. Trump looks to win. 5 of the 6 conservative justices seem open to backing the president. Unfortunately, but we'll see if they decide to flip. Continuing with the reporting. Saying lower courts have gone too far on the use of nationwide injunctions. Honestly, I don't think they've gone too far. That's just completely BS, if you ask me. But they also didn't seem ready to endorse a departure from the long-standing precedent from the Supreme Court upholding birthright citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, what is birthright citizenship? Well, for more than a century, courts have understood the text of the 14th Amendment to guarantee all persons born or naturalized in the United States to be U.S. citizens, no matter the immigration status of their parents. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at this reporting update by CNN that was just uploaded about 20 minutes ago. Protesters voice angry criticism of Trump's birthright citizenship order. Leading protesters chants of phrases like "Saisi Puido," "Yes we can," which is what it, ladies and gentlemen, translates to. Two immigrants' rights advocates brought unique perspectives Thursday to debate over President Donald Trump's executive order denying birthright citizenship to children born in the U.S. to non-citizen parents. Quote, "If I was born at this moment right now, I would unfortunately not have the right to citizenship in the United States," unquote, Linda, 21, said, who didn't want to give her last name. She was born in the United States to parents who were undocumented. Speaking to CNN outside the Supreme Court, Linda said she's concerned. I understand why she is concerned. that others in her situation in the future, quote, won't be able to have the same privileges that I've been able to have, unquote. She said not only did she graduate near the top of her high school class and attend college, she's also helped others along the way. Quote, I've been able to tutor more than 200 students while being here in the U.S. I've been able to help over 15 students graduate from high school. I've been able, she says, to help show them scholarships, mentorships, bring them to organizations that will help them thrive as well. Josie Sepernar, an immigrants' rights advocate with the group of CASA, told CNN she also would not be granted citizenship if she were born after the Trump order was enacted. She is the daughter of immigrants from Charlie. Quote, I would have nothing where I would be without any type of immigration, unquote, she said, presented with the perspective argument by the Trump administration that the order seeks to prevent birth terrorism, the practice of expectant mothers coming to the U.S. to give birth and secure citizenship for their children. Sepernar said, quote, the Constitution is crystal clear. President Trump, someone of any immigration status can come and have their child, and that child has earned citizenship per the Constitution, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, about an hour and 20 minutes ago, the Supreme Court seemed open to limiting the scope of birthright citizenship. And the scope of nationwide injunctions. But, ladies and gentlemen, they wrangled about an hour and 20 minutes ago over birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court on Thursday seemed open to lifting a nationwide order blocking President Donald Trump from enforcing his birthright citizenship policy, even as it wrestles over the practical implications of allowing the administration to deny citizenship documents to some people born in the United States. Several conservative justices signaled deep reservations with the ability of lower courts to issue nationwide injunctions, but at the same time seem to be searching for other ways people could, in the short term, stop a policy that would upend more than a century of understanding about American citizenship. After more than 2 hours of argument, it was not entirely clear how the court would resolve these two divergent goals. Several of the court's conservatives, including Chief Justice John Roberts, stressed that they could review the merits of Trump's executive order, quote, expeditiously, unquote, but appeared concerned about the nationwide injunctions that lower court judges had issued. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, ladies and gentlemen, a key vote in the conservative wing led several of his colleagues in suggesting the best approach might be to let those challenging the order do so another way, to file a class action lawsuit that might provide widespread protection but require lower court judges to make a more thorough review of who is considered by the order, covered by the order. That would be a higher hurdle for immigrant rights groups to clear, but not an impossible one. Without putting some other mechanism in place, wiping out the lower court's order against Trump would allow the administration to enforce his birthright citizenship policy throughout much of the nation, even though it appears to contravene the plain text of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to people born in the United States regardless of the immigration status of their parents. Ladies and gentlemen, about an hour and 46 minutes ago, justices say the court can move quickly. The Supreme Court can move quickly. But they unfortunately helped Trump and Sawyer when they chose not to. And ladies and gentlemen, the details from about an hour and 46 minutes ago read: several justices during today's oral arguments on birthright citizenship and nationwide injunctions noted that if the court needed to move quickly to decide the merits or constitutionality of an issue, it has proven it can. But President Trump and his former personal attorney, John Sauer, or however the hell you want to pronounce his last name. I thought it was Sauer or Sawyer because of the A right next to the U. Now, Solicitor General, unfortunately, he doesn't have the qualifications to be Solicitor General. Also know that when the Supreme Court wants to take its time, it can have a dramatic impact. In late 2023, anticipating the Supreme Court would eventually hear arguments on whether then former President Trump had immunity for his actions in the White House. Special counsel Jack Smith asked the court to accelerate the issue. The court declined and didn't hear arguments until April 2024 and didn't rule until July 1 when it sided with Trump. Unfortunately, they sided with Trump then, which look where the hell it got us. But thankfully, they have the power and they have the ability to overturn and take away his immunity. I did reporting on that in the past. There will be a link to my past reportings in the video description below. Continuing with the article, ladies and gentlemen. The delay meant that Smith's investigation was on hold for several months during the presidential campaign, and even had it sided with the special counsel, it may have ensured that any trial wouldn't be possible before November, aiding Trump and Sauer. Again, however the hell you want to say his name. Sauer's strategy to delay court action as long as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, about 2 hours and 10 minutes ago, the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson class actions and nationwide injunctions are conceptually different. And ladies and gentlemen, from what she said, this is what she said, and it reads, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson pulled back on the idea, touted especially by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, that class actions can step in the place of nationwide injunctions. Nationwide injunctions are doing a conceptually different thing than the class actions, Jackson said. The class actions give those covered within the class an enforceable right against the government, she asserted. But such rights are not granted to people nationwide with nationwide injunctions, she said. Instead, those people are just benefiting from an order that requires the government to obviously Ladies and gentlemen, I added the obviously. The article did not add, the obviously. To stop doing an unlawful thing, the liberal justice said. Ladies and gentlemen, about 2 hours and 20 minutes ago, about 2 hours and 26 minutes ago, Kavanaugh suggested class action lawsuits could replace need for nationwide injunctions. And ladies and gentlemen, here is what Justice Kavanaugh said, and his arguments read, Justice Brett Kavanaugh suggested that class certification would suffice, for allowing the challengers to get broad relief from President Donald Trump's executive order, and he brushed away with the argument from a lawyer for those challengers that relying on class certification as a tool raises many of the same issues as nationwide injunctions. Kavanaugh asked Kelsey Corcoran, who is representing individuals and immigration advocacy groups who are arguing in favor of the universal injunctions in the case, doesn't class action resolve the problem? Corcoran countered that with that option, many of the concerns raised about the nationwide injunctions include those raised by Justice Alito earlier in the argument, like forum shopping and foisting emergency disputes on the Supreme Court would still exist. That point didn't seem to sway Kavanaugh. He didn't disagree, but stressed that the class actions, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I added the ladies and gentlemen. The article did not add the ladies and gentlemen. Might be the technically appropriate way of approaching the dispute under existing court rules. We care about technicalities, Justice Kavanaugh said. Ladies and gentlemen, about 2 hours and 43 minutes ago, conservative justices seemed open to siding with Trump. Unfortunately, I don't see who could side with Trump, especially with the illegality that he is doing. Pretty much they're saying F the Constitution. At least those that are siding with Trump, or at least have appeared to be open to siding with the illegal uh, sexual predator. Several courts conservatives seem open to siding with President Donald Trump on the idea that lower courts went too far in blocking his birthright citizenship executive order on a nationwide basis. In question after question, key conservative votes, including Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh, suggested that there might be better ways for individuals challenging the order to shut it down on a temporary basis. Roberts repeatedly suggested that the merits and constitutionality of Trump's order could get back to the Supreme Court. In short, the Supreme Court, Roberts said, would deal with the merits of Trump's order with reasonable expedition. And you think it's very possible that class certification may be granted, Kavanaugh said, who appeared to be attempting to fish out the next steps of the legal case if Trump wins in the short term. Let's hope to God that Trump does not win in the short term. Because F Donald Trump, F the president, F his illegality. If the court ultimately moves in that direction, it could allow the administration to enforce its birthright citizenship order through much of the nation. At least in the short term, it would likely lead to a flurry of new lawsuits attempting to shut the order down with other legal claims. Ladies and gentlemen, about 2 hours and 51 minutes ago, Kelsey Corcoran seasoned the Supreme Court of the United States litigator is arguing on behalf of immigrant rights groups expecting mothers. Ladies and gentlemen, and that recap reads: Kelsey Corcoran, an attorney for immigrant rights groups and expecting mothers, has started pressing the justices to keep the lower court injunction intact. Corcoran, the Supreme Court director at Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, is a seasoned advocate at the High Court. She's previously argued before the justices in high-profile cases concerning homelessness, civil rights, and police conduct. Her clients in the birthright citizenship challenge include CASA, Inc., and the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project, Inc., Incorporated, as well as several pregnant mothers, some of whom are members, of other groups. Quote, an important opponent of Kelsey's practice is preserving favorable civil rights decisions issued by the federal courts of appeals, the official's bio reads. Corcoran previously held positions at the Supreme Court, at the Justice Department and in the White House under former President Barack Obama, and served as a clerk for the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm doing here is giving you guys a recap in case you guys either missed the arguments or are not currently listening to them, because I understand majority of you have other things going on. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 hours ago, these pregnant women are watching the arguments with fear. Unfortunately, I am recapping. As I'm recapping and recording this video, I am getting fear chills, in a sense, reporting this recap to you guys. Several pregnant women who are in the U.S. legally, but with temporary immigration status, told CNN this month that they fear their children will be born stateless. Quote, there's been a lot of fear. One expecting mother told CNN, quote, every day it's a new restriction and we don't know what will happen, unquote. Another said that she was already pregnant when she discovered that President Donald Trump would make a major political issue out of birthright citizenship. Quote, I remember thinking it was so scary that my son had not yet been born and that his rights would be violated, unquote, she told CNN. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to the to this article. I will have a link leading to reading more about the impact of the Supreme Court case. The potential impact of the Supreme Court case down below in the video description. Ladies and gentlemen, about 3 hours and 9 minutes ago, New Jersey lawyer, don't draw a bright line, ending nationwide injunctions. Ladies and gentlemen, here's what that oral argument states from the New Jersey lawyer. New Jersey Solicitor General Jeremy Furgenbaum, arguing for the Democratic-led states, challenging the president's order, expressed sympathy with concerns that have been raised about nationwide injunctions. But he urged the Supreme Court to avoid drawing a bright line around them, arguing instead that the court could lay out criteria that would help lower courts decide when they're appropriate. He kept pressuring the point after a lengthy question from the conservative Justice Samuel Alito. Ladies and gentlemen, I added the word "the." The article does not state the word "the." Who said that trial judges have an occupational disease of thinking they're always right and that there's nothing constraining them from imposing that judgment nationwide? Okay, really, Alito, you're just bad news and you're blatantly corrupt. Occupational disease? What in the world are you smoking? Furgenbaum brought up the Texas lawsuit challenging the immigration program known as DACA, which gave deportation protections to certain immigrants brought to the U.S. at a young age, as an example of case where it was a clear nationwide injunction wasn't appropriate. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, Texas argued that DACA was costing it money because of the benefits that the state had to give immigrants covered under the program. Blocking the program just in that state wasn't enough to address those harms, Furgenbaum said, so a nationwide injunction was not necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, about 3 hours and 32 minutes ago, Jackson summarized Trump's DOJ argument as "catch me if you can." And ladies and gentlemen, that summarization of Justice Jackson's argument reads, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson pressed Sauer, again, however the hell you want to say his name, and pronounce it, on whether his opposition to a universal injunction in the case in the citizenship birthright, case could lead to requiring every individual to file their own lawsuit in the case. Quote, the real concern, I think, is that your argument seems to turn our justice system, in my view, at least into a catch me if you can kind of regimen. Regimen. Jackson said, adding, quote, where everybody has to have a lawyer and file a lawsuit in order for the government to stop violating people's rights, unquote. Sawyer, or again, Sawyer, or however you want to pronounce his name and say it, countered that Jackson's catch me if you can system negatively impacts the administration, pushing them to battle each and every jurisdiction where cases could pop up. Quote, I think the catch me if you can problem operates in the opposite direction, unquote. Sawyer, or however the hell again you want to say his name, said, adding, quote, I think quote, where we have the government racing from just jurisdiction to jurisdiction, having to sort of clear the table in order to implement a new policy, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, about 3 hours and 33 minutes ago, Justice Brett Kavanaugh Barrett, Justice Barrett emerges as key vote in birthright citizenship. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, ladies and gentlemen, that recap reads, a member of the court's conservative wing repeatedly pressed President Donald Trump's attorneys about why the government is avoiding the merits of the birthright citizenship case. In her line of question drew an important concession from Solicitor General D. John Sawyer. Again, ladies and gentlemen, however the hell you want to say his name or pronounce it, who acknowledged the legal arguments defending the merits of Trump's order were, quote, novel, unquote, and, quote, sensitive, unquote. Quote, so this one isn't clear cut on the merits, unquote, Barrett asked. Sawyer, again, however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, agreed. Barrett also expressed, pressed Sawyer, again, however the hell you want to say his name, on why the government is opposed to a nation why the government is opposed to a nationwide injunction, but generally willing to accept a class action judgment that would likely have the same effect. Quote, why does the government care? Ladies and gentlemen, Justice Barrett asked. Sauer or Sawyer, again, however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, responded with 2 points. First, securing the class action can be more difficult. A second class action judgment would require challengers to put more skin to the fight. In other words, if the members of the class action lost, they would collectively also be bound by the decision the same way the government is. Ladies and gentlemen, about 3 hours and 13 minutes ago, Justice Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh grilled Trump on the practicality of rolling back nationwide injunctions. Ladies and gentlemen, and that recap reads, conservative justices Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Brett Kavanaugh dug into the practical challenges of implementing President Donald Trump's birthright citizenship executive order if the nationwide injunctions were rolled back. The justices will be the key in deciding the case. Barrett focused on the arguments put forward by the blue states challenging Trump's order, that even if the policy is blocked within their borders, allowing it to move forward in order, other states would cause harm to the plaintiffs' states because of the way people move from one state to another. Kavanaugh brought up the 30-day, quote, ramp up, unquote, period. The Trump order lays out before it goes into effect. He interjected repeatedly when Solicitor General John Sauer, or Sawyer, however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, ladies and gentlemen, couldn't give him specifics he was seeking on how the order would work logistically once that period ran out. Pressed about what hospitals, ladies and gentlemen, and states do about a newborn covered under Trump's order, Sauer or Sawyer, again, however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, tried to argue that the order puts the onus, or on us, or however that's pronounced, on federal officials to implement it. They are tasked with refusing to accept certain citizenship documents from the children. The Trump order exempts from the birthright citizenship. From birthright citizenship. Quote, how are they going to do that? Kavanaugh, unquote, Kavanaugh asked. Federal officials will, quote, figure it out, unquote, Sawyer or Sauer. Again, however the hell you want to say his name, said, or says. Or, offered. Quote, as such, unquote, Kavanaugh hammered. Sawyer or Sauer. Again, however the hell you want to say his name, ladies and gentlemen. Tried again to lay out hypothetically how enforcement would work, but with Kavanaugh continuing to press him. Sawyer or Sauer. Again, however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, ladies and gentlemen. Blamed courts for pausing the ramp-up period that would have allowed the agencies to work out these policies. Quote, they're only going to have 30 days to do this. You think they get it together in time? Kavanaugh asked. Ladies and gentlemen, about 4 hours and 3 minutes ago, New Jersey Solicitor General Jeremy Furgenbaum at the lectern representing states and cities argument stated New Jersey Solicitor General Jeremy Furgenbaum spoke in this case, because, ladies and gentlemen, it's past tense, he did it in the past. Furgenbaum spoke on behalf of the states and cities challenging President Donald Trump's executive order targeting birthright citizenship. Among his clients are more than 20 states, the District of Columbia, and the county and city of San Francisco. This isn't Furgenbaum's first time in the well of the ornate courtroom. Having served as the Garden State's Solicitor General for nearly 5 years, he successfully argued a case before the High Court, a 2013 dispute over whether New Jersey could leave a long-standing port policing compact it had with New York. 2 years later, he argued and lost a major case involving the federal government's use, ladies and gentlemen, of eminent domain to build a pipeline in the state. A 2014 graduate of Harvard Law School, Ferguson clerked for Justice Elena Kagan, ladies and gentlemen, and later worked in private practice before joining the New Jersey Attorney General's office. Ladies and gentlemen, about 3 hours and 57 minutes ago, Sauer said that the DOJ, quote, generally follows court precedents. Here we go with that generally follows when the government is obligated to follow court orders and precedents, ladies and gentlemen, as per the duties listed of the President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, that recap reads, Justice Amy Coney Barrett pushed Solicitor General D. John Sauer. Ladies and gentlemen, again, however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, to say the government will abide by court rulings, but the administration's top appellate attorney wouldn't fully commit to the idea. Sawyer, again, ladies and gentlemen, however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce his name, said it was the Justice Department's, quote, long-standing policy of the Department of Justice, unquote, to respect appeals court precedents, but that, quote, there are circumstances when it is not a categorical practice, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, really, Barrett asked, quote, generally, as it was phrased to me, generally respect circuit precedents, but not necessarily in every case, unquote. Sawyer, or however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, said. Barrett continued to challenge Sawyer, or Sauer, or however the hell you want to say his name, saying she wasn't asking about enforcing, quote, a case from 1955, and you think it's time for it to be challenged, unquote. Quote, I'm talking about this week. The Second Circuit holds that the executive order is unconstitutional, unquote, she said. Ladies and gentlemen, adding that quote, what do you do the next day or the next week, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, She concluded, quote, generally, Sour or Sawyer, or however the heck you want to say his name, said, we follow, unquote. Sour or Sawyer responded. Barrett continued, ladies and gentlemen, quote, so you're saying generally, unquote. This quote from Sawyer, or Sour, or however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it. Quote, yes. Ladies and gentlemen, about 4 hours, 15 minutes ago, liberal justices slammed Trump's position on birthright citizenship. And ladies and gentlemen, that recap reads, President Donald Trump's top appellate attorney faced at times devastating questions from the liberal wing of the Supreme Court during the first round of questioning about the practicality of allowing the administration to enforce its ban on birthright citizenship. The court's three-justice liberal bloc, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson pressured Sawyer or Sour, or however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, ladies and gentlemen, aggressively on the administration's position that the case is only about limiting the scope of lower court injunctions that blocked Trump from implementing his policy. Quote, if you win this challenge and say there is no nationwide injunction, unquote, Kagan said, adding, ladies and gentlemen, quote, then I can't see how an individual who is not being treated equitably would have any ability to bring the substantive question to us, unquote. In other words, Kagan suggested the Trump administration would require everyone potentially affected by the order to file their own suit. But the court's three liberals are well short of a majority, and many of the court's conservatives have appeared less concerned about the potential practical impact. In early questioning, Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Neil Gorsuch, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh all signaled at certain points that they might potentially side with Trump. Let's hope that they do not side with the Trump administration, considering how unconstitutional, illegal, and unlawful and lawlessness that they are. One expectation was Amy Coney Barrett, who pressed Sawyer or Sour or however the hell again you want to say his name, on the practical implications of allowing the order to take effect. But Barrett, Chief Justice John Roberts, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh often ask difficult questions of both sides. Ladies and gentlemen, about 4 hours and 24 minutes ago, snap judgments. Sawyer or Sour, however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, argued lower courts have ignored the merits of citizenship cases. Citizen birthright cases. That is a bunch of baloney right there. They have not ignored the merits. And ladies and gentlemen, the argument reads, Solicitor General John Sauer, or however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, argued that federal courts who rejected Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship did so by, quote, snap judgments, unquote. No, they didn't. They did not provide any snap judgments. That's a bunch of baloney. Failing to address the underlying arguments in the case, Justice Sonia Sotomayor pressed Sour or Sawyer, however the hell you want to say his name, ladies and gentlemen, on courts finding that the Trump administration was violating, quote, not only President, but the plain meaning of the Constitution, unquote. Quote, respectfully, I think what we have are lower courts making snap judgments on the merits that ignore the fundamental principle of the 14th Amendment, unquote, Sawyer or Sour, or however the heck you want to say his name, said. Adding, ladies and gentlemen, that, quote, it was about giving citizenship to the children of slaves, not to the children of illegal immigrants, who really were not even very discreet class at the time, unquote. Quote, and there were some people in Congress who argued against the 14th Amendment just because of that, unquote, Sotomayor replied. Ladies and gentlemen, adding, quote, because it would give citizenship to gypsies, unquote, Sawyer or Sour, or however the hell you want to pronounce and say his name, argued that, quote, domicile, unquote, was the, quote, key criteria, unquote, quote, and it got rejected repeatedly, unquote. Sotomayor said of that argument, quote, you claim that there is absolutely no constitutional way to stop a president from unconstitutional act, or an unconstitutional act. Excuse me, unquote. Sotomayor concluded. Ladies and gentlemen, about 4 hours and 35 minutes ago, ladies and gentlemen, Chief Justice John Roberts briefly gives Sawyer or Sauer, or however the hell you want to say his name, a lifeline. Chief Justice John Roberts bailed the Solicitor General out as he was struggling with a series of tough questions about how long, under his theory, it would take to issue a ruling protecting people nationwide from an illegal presidential policy. Roberts offered the example of the TikTok ban case earlier this year to suggest that the High Court can act quickly when it needs to. The court has been accused of moving too slow, such as in the Trump criminal immunity case last year. But Solicitor General D. John Sauer, or Sawyer, or however the hell you want to say his last name, was eager to agree with Roberts' suggestion that even without the universal injunction tool being available to lower courts, the High Court could settle major legal questions on questions nationwide on a quick time frame. Justice Elena Kagan followed up on the point to say that the government could still delay or put off altogether such a nationwide ruling coming from the Supreme Court. Kagan argued that if the administration kept losing at lower courts, there would be, quote, no incentive, unquote, for the government to take the case to the Supreme Court, as long as these lower courts were only able to block the policy for individual plaintiffs. Quote, if I were in your shoes, there's no way I'd approach the Supreme Court with this case, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, Kagan said, to guarantee the merits question reached the Supreme Court, you need somebody to lose, but no one is going to lose in this case, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, about 4 hours and 48 minutes ago. Justice Kagan, let's assume you're dead wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, and that argument reads, Justice Elena Kagan is getting to the heart of the practical questions about what would happen if the High Court sides with Trump on the issue of the nationwide on the issue of nationwide injunctions. Quote, let's assume you're dead wrong, unquote, on the underlying legality of Trump's executive order, Kagan said. What happens to people in the meantime, she said, while Trump is permitted to enforce an order that appears to directly contradict the text of the 14th Amendment. Quote, if one thinks that it's quite clear that the EO is illegal, how does one get to that result? And with what time frame, unquote, Kagan pressed. Ladies and gentlemen, Sauer or Sawyer, or however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, tried to respond by discussing the court's ability to quickly move to the merits and that challengers could potentially file a class action lawsuit. But Sawyer, or Sauer, or however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, also acknowledged that the government would likely challenge that attempt. Quote, that's a lot of words, unquote, Kagan said, adding, quote, I don't have an answer. Sawyers or Sowers, ladies and gentlemen, however you want to say and pronounce his last name, tepid response drew Justice Amy Coney Barrett into the debate. Quote, are you really going to answer Justice Kagan by saying there's no way to answer this expeditiously, unquote? But Roberts notably exceeded that the exchange by throwing cold water on the idea that courts couldn't resolve the merits of a dispute quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 hours ago, Justice Sotomayor, on Trump's executive order, that said that Trump's executive order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents. Justice Sotomayor, ladies and gentlemen, Justice Sotomayor's statement reads, or read because it was said 4 hours ago. Questioned Solicitor General D. John Sauer. Again, Sawyer, or however the hell you want to pronounce his last name, on whether his request to block the lower court's decision to issue a nationwide injunction would block future Supreme Court rulings from being fully implemented. Sawyer, or Sauer, ladies and gentlemen, or Sauer, said Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which outlines the power that federal courts have, prohibits the courts from issuing the nationwide injunctions. Quote, even if the Supreme Court doesn't have that right and thus invites hundreds of thousands of lawsuits, what are we buying into, unquote, Sotomayor asked, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Solicitor General pushed back that individual plaintiffs could continue to challenge orders like the order on birthright citizenship at issue here instead of joining together so that they could have individual rulings on their own circumstances. Quote, so as far as I see it, this order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents, unquote, Sotomayor said. Ladies and gentlemen, adding, quote, and you are, quote, and you are, ladies and gentlemen, honestly, I think that was a typo right there. And you are claiming that not just the Supreme Court, that both the Supreme Court and no lower court can stop an executive order universally from violating that holding, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 hours and 16 minutes ago, Chief Justice John Roberts presses Sawyer or Sauer, or ladies and gentlemen, however the hell you want to say his name, on nationwide injunctions theory. And ladies and gentlemen, that recap reads, Chief Justice John Roberts asked Solicitor General John D. John Sauer, or Sawyer, or however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it. A thorny question about how his theory on nationwide injunctions would apply in another type of case, redistricting. It's an argument that those opposing President Donald Trump's Donald Trump repeatedly raised in their briefs. If courts are unable to apply injunctions beyond parties that sue, how could they resolve a redistrictive case that would essentially apply to everyone in a state? Unquote. Quote, how does your theory address that situation? Unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, Roberts asked. Sawyer or Sour, however you want to pronounce it and say his name, ladies and gentlemen, argued that essentially districting are a different type of case and can only be solved with a wide geographic resolution. The question suggests Roberts may have concerns with Sawyer's or Sowers, or however the hell you want to pronounce his last names, position, ladies and gentlemen. But the chief did not follow up or press the point. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 hours and 23 minutes ago, Sawyer or Sour, or however the hell you want to say his name and pronounce it, pushed back on Sotomayor's comparison of a president taking away Americans' guns. Justice Sonia Sotomayor's tough line of questions for Solicitor General D. John Sauer, or again, Sawyer, or however the hell you want to pronounce his last name, culminated in her putting forward a hypothetical: what would courts be allowed to do if a new president, citing the scourge of gun violence, issued an executive order that the military take away everyone's guns. She had been stressing that in this case, Trump's birthright citizenship policy appeared to be a blatant violation of multiple court precedents. Would courts have to sit back and wait for individuals to sue one by one to challenge the constitutionality of such an order? Ladies and gentlemen, Sonia Sotomayor asked. Sour or Sawyer, ladies and gentlemen, however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, offered the possibility of emergency certified class actions in such a situation, but he also claimed that President Donald Trump's birthright citizenship order is on firm constitutional grounds, making it not analogous to the example put forth by Sotomayor. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 hours and 32 minutes ago, Justice Clarence Thomas asked for historic analysis historical analysis, ladies and gentlemen. Analogs. Of universal injunctions. Ladies and gentlemen, and that recap reads: Justice Clarence Thomas, the most senior member of the court, has the first question at the Supreme Court at Thursday's arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, at today's oral arguments, because they happened today. So what I'm going to do is replace Thursday's oral arguments with today's oral arguments. Asking Solicitor General John Sauer again, Sawyer, or however the heck you want to say his name, about the, quote, origins, unquote, of universal injunctions. The question fits into his interest across merit cases in using history and tradition to decide legal questions. Querying about the, quote, historical analogs, ladies and gentlemen. Unquote. Thomas asked Sawyer or Sauer, or however the heck you want to say his name, about an example President Donald Trump's opponents show that universal injunctions are rooted in history. Sauer or Sawyer, however the hell you want to say and pronounce his name, ladies and gentlemen, countered that the example known as a Bill of Peace was more analog to class action lawsuits. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 hours and 47 minutes ago, Trump's newly confirmed Solicitor General John D. Sawyer, ladies and gentlemen, returned to the Supreme Court President Donald Trump, ladies and gentlemen, the recap reads, is being repeatedly, represented by an attorney who has enjoyed significant success at the nation's highest court. Newly confirmed Solicitor General John D. Sauer, or Sawyer, ladies and gentlemen, however the hell you want to say his name. Sawyer or Sauer, ladies and gentlemen, however the hell you want to say his name. A Rhode Island scholar, or a Ron scholar, ladies and gentlemen, who clerked for the late Justice Antonin Scalia, is perhaps best known for arguing the Supreme Court case last year that led to Trump receiving broad immunity from criminal prosecution. Given the importance of that case, for Trump, it was no surprise that, the president tapped him last fall to serve as his top appellate attorney in the Justice Department. The former Solicitor General of Missouri, Sauer or Sawyer, however the hell you want to say his name, ladies and gentlemen, was confirmed by the Senate in April. This is Sauer's or Sawyer's, or however the hell you want to say his last name, ladies and gentlemen. Second time arguing before the High Court as Trump's Solicitor General. He represented the administration last month in another high-profile case involving the first religious charter school in the nation. The administration was supporting the school in that case. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 hours and 57 minutes ago, two key justices watched in birthright citizenship arguments, Kavanaugh and Barrett. And ladies and gentlemen, that previous argument read a little more than a year ago, the Supreme Court allowed Idaho officials to temporarily enforce a strict statewide ban on gender-affirming care for most minors. The one-paragraph ruling and the 34-page of separate opinions, pages of separate opinions that accompanied it may offer some clues into how the justices are thinking about the case before them, involving the enforcement of President Donald Trump's birthright citizenship order. Like Trump's case, Idaho's was also a request to limit the scope of a universal injunction. In that case, statewide instead of nationwide, like Trump, officials in Idaho complained of judicial overreach. Three of the court's conservatives, Justice Neil Gorsuch, Samuel Alito, and Clarence Thomas, called for, quote, retiring, unquote, universal injunctions, which they said might lead to, quote, less drama and excitement, unquote, but more in humanity for the federal bench. Two of the court's liberals, Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor, laid out an argument for mostly not engaging with the appeals courts, appeals when lower courts temporarily block laws from taking effect. And then there was Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who appeared to be searching for a middle ground answer to that thorny question of how to handle universal injunctions. Ketanji Brown Jackson, Kavanaugh, said in a ruling eliminating them, quote, may, unquote, be the right answer, but he also suggested such a rule wouldn't necessarily solve all the problems critics, including Trump, have raised. In other questions, Kavanaugh and Barrett appeared to be keeping their options open. What would happen, Kavanaugh pondered in his concurring opinion, if different appeals courts reached different conclusions about what to do with a contested law that, absent a nationwide order, would then be enforced in one part of the country but not another. Quote, that disinformity could often be highly problematic, unquote, he wrote. The potential for disuniformity, unquote, said, as Kavanaugh put it, precisely what critics say. Will happen if Trump is allowed to enforce his birthright citizenship order in some states but not others. One conclusion Kavanaugh reached, and that Barrett has also emphasized, is that the court should take care of to put a heavy focus on whether the justices are likely to decide a case on the merits before doling out emergency relief from its enforcement, given that every court to review Trump's birthright order has ruled against it it's not clear how much appetite there is at this point to someday consider the policy's legality on the merits. Two justices did not explain their votes in the Idaho case. Labrador v. Poe, Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Elena Kagan both are often viewed as being able to meet in the middle, and both will also be critically important to watch during Thursday's arguments. During today's arguments. About 6 hours and 2 minutes ago, ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court oral arguments began. And ladies and gentlemen, that final recap reads, oral arguments have begun at the Supreme Court as it hears cases about President Donald Trump's plan to end birthright citizenship that could significantly limit the power of federal courts to slow his agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, about 4 hours and 15 minutes ago, American children, anti-Trump protesters gather outside Supreme Court. And ladies and gentlemen, several dozens of protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court on Thursday. Today. About an hour before justices were set to hear arguments in the case over enforcing President Donald Trump's birthright citizenship order, with blaring and at times competing sound systems. The protesters alternated between English and Spanish, but the message in either language was clear. Birthright citizenship, the protesters argued, should be preserved. The vast majority of protesters held signs or wore t-shirts indicating they support the states and immigrant rights groups challenging Trump's order. Quote, American-born children are American children, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, one sign read, quote, birthright citizenship, unquote. Another sign read, ladies and gentlemen, concluding with, quote, it's a constitutional right, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, about 7 hours and 17 minutes ago, 7 minutes ago, Trump's lawyers do not want Supreme Court of the United States to focus on birthright citizenship. Trump is undercutting their argument. Of course, he undercutted their argument. And that recap reads, while Justice Department attorneys who are defending President Donald Trump's executive orders seeking to end birthright citizenship before the Supreme Court today have consistently said they want to avoid the issue, Trump himself has no such intention. In a lengthy Truth Social post this morning, Trump stressed the importance of ending birthright citizenship to his anti-immigration agenda. Quote, the case today in the Supreme Court, in the United States Supreme Court, birthright citizenship was not meant for people taking vacations to become permanent citizens of the United States of America and bringing their families with them all the time, laughing at these, quote, suckers that we are, exclaimed Trump in his Truth Social post, ladies and gentlemen. Trump also stressed a legal theory at the birthright citizenship promise was only about ensuring the, quote, babies of slaves, unquote, had clear citizenship rights following the Civil War, adding, ladies and gentlemen, quote, please explain this to the Supreme Court of the United States, unquote, the president wrote. But Trump's attempt to end constitutional protections regarding birthright citizenship contradicts the plain words of the 14th Amendment and would thus reverse an 1898 Supreme Court milestone. CNN Chief Supreme Court Analyst John Biskupic wrote, that case, which came decades after the Civil War, has nothing to do with the children of slaves. It was brought by the son of Chinese nationals during a period of anti-immigration fervor aimed at the Chinese. The court's ruling was unambiguous. Quote, the amendment, is clear. Words and in manifest intent includes the children born within the territory of the United States, unquote. Justice Horace Gray wrote for the majority, quote, every citizen or subject of another country while domiciled here is within the allegiance and the protection and consequently subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, about 6 hours and 49 minutes ago, Won Kim Ark, Supreme Court president from 1898, implicated in birthright citizenship case. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to this piece of the 1898 ruling in the video description below, so you guys can read it for yourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, this paper that you see above, that I will have a link to down below in the video description, certified that Won Kim Ark was able to follow through with his plan to leave the United States and return. Thus, 3 men signed this letter. Ladies and gentlemen, I added thus. The article does not indicate the word thus. Signed this letter to his identity. Included with the attestation is a signature of witness, who is the notary Robert M. Edward, and a photograph of Won Kim Ark. If the Supreme Court justices spend any time discussing the merits of President Donald Trump's birthright citizenship order, there's a good chance the name Won Kim Ark will come up. Wong was born in the United States to Chinese parents who at the time were subjects of the Emperor of China, unquote. At the time when anti-immigration fervor was particularly directed at the Chinese, Wong left the United States to visit relatives in the United States, but was denied re-entry on the grounds that he lacked American citizenship. The Supreme Court of the United States ultimately ruled in favor of 1898. Won Kim Ark ultimately ruled in 1998 that the plain words of the 14th Amendment protected Wong, and that people born in the United States were entitled to citizenship. The Trump administration has focused on what it sees as caveat to that general rule. The Supreme Court noted that Wong's parents had a prominent domicile and residence in the United States, unquote. The ruling that the administration has argued doesn't apply to non-citizens parents who are, quote, accidentally or temporarily in the United States, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to the article that says right here on the screen, read more about how the modern U.S. Or modern Supreme Court may view the citizenship clause. Ladies and gentlemen, about 7 hours and 25 minutes ago, divided Supreme Court on full display heading into birthright citizenship hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, and that recap reads, the Supreme Court that will hear a case over birthright citizenship this week has been acting less like a group seeking consensus and more like 9 justices clinging to their own interests. Ruptures have occurred in litigation arising from President Donald Trump's effort to transform the federal government and remake America. But more broadly, the fractured court has been evident in the justices' separate opinions, behavior on the bench, and the public appearances. Justices have increasingly gone their own way in memoirs and books, too. As a result, the court may be less inclined to speak with one voice. The ravine justices could, as the country hurdles towards a possible constitutional showdown, risk appearing like yet another set of political actors unable to meet head-on threats of the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, about 8 hours and 1 minute ago, it's 2025 and cameras are still, unfortunately, not allowed for documentation, my editorials note. Inside the Supreme Court. There was no video of today's arguments, live or otherwise, despite a recent request by C-SPAN to carry the proceedings live. That's because the Supreme Court has never allowed cameras in its courtroom during proceedings, rejecting years of calls from TV networks, public interests groups, and lawmakers for greater transparency of its work. The latest such appeal came late last month from C-SPAN, which said in a letter to Chief Justice John Roberts that the, quote, public deserves to witness fully and directly how such a consequential issue is argued before the highest court of the land, unquote. But that request, ladies and gentlemen, has gone unanswered, the network said. Still, public access to the High Court got a significant boost in recent years. When the COVID-19 pandemic shuttered courthouses in 2020, the justices began conducting oral arguments by telephone and streaming audio of the proceedings over the court's website. Though the justices eventually returned to their physical bench, the court has continued providing a live audio feed during arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, about 8 hours and 18 minutes ago, the Supreme Court sometimes upheld injunctions against Biden too. As part, ladies and gentlemen, that argument read because it was read in the past. As part of the arguments for enforcing its birthright citizenship policy, President Donald Trump's lawyers have frequently pointed out that presidents of both parties have chafed against lower courts blocking their policies on a nationwide basis, and that such is true. But it's also the case that the Supreme Court has at times upheld nationwide injunctions against President Trump's predecessors. Back in 2021, when President Joe Biden was attempted to roll back Trump's Remain in Mexico policy for certain migrants, a federal district court issued a nationwide injunction blocking that effort from moving forward. Biden appealed to the Supreme Court seeking to stay that injunction and was rebuffed. The court said the administration, quote, failed to show a likeliness of success on its claim. The liberal justices and conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett dissented. And just last year, the Supreme Court declined to lift a sweeping block on one of Biden's student loan repayment plans that aimed to slash monthly payments and quicken the path to loan forgiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, about 8 hours and 40 minutes ago, Supreme Court of the United States heard the oral arguments in birthright in the birthright citizenship case. Here are key things to know. And ladies and gentlemen, past memoir, or uh, case or briefing, or whatever you want to call it, reads: President Donald Trump has long been vocal about his desire to end birthright citizenship, and on his first day back in office, he signed an executive order that sought to do just that. Now, the Supreme Court heard arguments about whether Trump can enforce that order through most of the country. Arguments in the court were heard and began shortly after 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Trump's order, titled Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship, barred the federal government from issuing documents recognizing the United States citizenship to any child born on American soil to parents who were born in the country unlawfully or were in the United States lawfully but temporarily. The move was quickly met with several legal challenges, of course. Rightfully, legally, constitutionally, lawfully, and overall lawfully. My editorial's note, I added that part, ladies and gentlemen. In the United States and around the country, and in the case, in 3 cases before the High Court today, federal judges issued rulings indefinitely blocking enforcement of the order, which each of the judges concluded was likely unlawful. The issue before the Supreme Court is whether the courts overstepped their authority by issuing nationwide injunctions that applied to everyone, not just the states, groups, and individuals who sued. But while the merits of Trump's order is not before the court, was not before the court, a ruling for Trump would allow him to enforce a policy that critics say clearly conflicts with the 14th Amendment's Citizenship Clause, which was added to the Constitution after the Civil War to extend U.S. citizenship to newly freed slaves. Quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside, unquote. The amendment reads in part. One of the judges who ruled against President Trump, Deborah Boardman of the Federal District Court in Maryland, said in February that the order, quote, conflicts with the plain language of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment contradicts 125 years of binding Supreme Court precedent and runs counter to our nation's 250-year history of citizenship by birth, unquote. Federal appeals courts in Boston, Richmond, and San Francisco turned down requests to lift or narrow the injunctions, leading his administration to appeal to the justices on an emergency basis. Though the High Court won't be deciding now whether Trump can end birthright citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, just so all you MAGA folk are clear, though that they won't be deciding Donald Trump's BS claim right now. Part of their analysis for why he should or shouldn't be able to partially or fully implement the executive order will rest on how likely they think it is to prevail during a later stage in the litigation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, looks like that's gonna do it for today's legal breaking reporting and a legal analysis reporting video for today. At least for right now, until we get more information. Once we do get more information, ladies and gentlemen, as to the results, hopefully they're still in favor of keeping the 1898 ruling intact, because F Donald Trump, obviously, because he's doing something illegal. That is going to do it for today's legal breaking reporting for now, ladies and gentlemen, until we get more information as per results. If you did enjoy this legal breaking reporting and analysis video, update and reporting on the birthright citizenship arguments of the Supreme Court today, ladies and gentlemen, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing firstly. Secondly, if you want to make sure you're always up to date on all the things legal breaking reporting wise on the side of politics, please please like, comment, share, subscribe, and enjoy. Secondly, if you want to make sure always up to date on all the things legal breaking reporting wise on the side of politics, please consider hitting the bell icon as well as the all notifications option. The bell icon is located directly below the screen here on the right hand side of the subscribe button. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, if you also want to stay up to date on all the things legal breaking reporting wise on the side of politics, please consider following me on my social medias. That'll be linked down below. I'm on Instagram, Snapchat, Threads, as well as TikTok. There you guys will be instantly updated on when I posted legal breaking analysis reporting videos on the side of politics. Fourthly, ladies and gentlemen, please help me reach and achieve the goal of 160 plus subscribers. The reason why I'm saying 160 plus subscribers is because right after we reach and achieve the goal of 160 subscribers, we have more subscribers to reach and achieve right after we reach and achieve the goal of 160 subscribers. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, please stay positive. Even though I know at times it's hard for you guys to stay positive, it's even hard for me at times, unfortunately, to stay positive during these unfortunate induced illegal darkness times caused by the illegal Trump administration, Trump regime. And know that justice will prevail on the correct side of the law eventually, despite Donald Trump and his illegal, unlawful administration and regimes along unconstitutional executive orders, actions, behaviors, and lawlessness. That is all for now, folks. I will talk to you guys in the next legal breaking reporting.